welcome. This is Travels with Tom. Again, this is our fourth time that we've taken these trips, and it's kind of fun. This time we're going to Colorado, New Mexico, and just a little bit of West Texas on this trip. This was last September that I went. I went with my buddy Carl Wolf, same guy I've traveled with for the last few years. And, of course, this is the classic picture of him taking a picture of me taking a picture of him. So there we are. But, we're together again with remember the story that goes with this. Carl and I have known each other for about 15 years through but mostly youth work in our church. And our wives are still working, and Carl retired. He's retired Air Force, and, of course, I retired now 9 years ago. And we were sitting at a church dinner together with our wives. I was mentioning that, I've never been to Yellowstone. I'd love to go to Yellowstone now that I'm retired and all that. And Carl said, well, I'll go with you. So I said, okay, great. And both our wives said, good, you guys go, because we don't want to do that stuff. So it's kind of fun that they allow us to do these things. And when they finally retire, I'm sure our ventures will change. Some of you know my wife. Her idea of roughing it is no chocolate on the pillow. So camping and stuff is not so it's good. Go get all that stuff out of your system before I retire. So we do these sort of ventures. And this one, we had planned this actually 2 years ago. To go to some of the native sites that I've wanted to see for many, many years, like Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, Bandelier, and then also some of the other sites like Carlsbad, White Sands, and the Guadalupe Mountains. There's also another side story. Carl and Katrina's son, Scott, was a senior at the University of North Dakota as a meteorologist, and he was also in the Air Force ROTC. And he was going to be stationed either in Tucson or Shreveport. So they decided last year, at this time of the year on spring break, that they would accompany Scott to Tucson and sort of look over the area. And we had already planned to go to Santa Fe. And they said, well, we're not that far away. We'll drop Scott back off, and then we'll send him in the airport, and then we'll go over to Santa Fe. Well, not only did they go to Santa Fe, they bought a house in Santa Fe. They liked it so much. So they actually moved to Santa Fe. So it was kind of fun. But we still do our adventures together, and we're going on another one this year, too. We'll talk about that later. But we started out, because they were now in Santa Fe, I flew to Denver, and Carl picked me up in Denver, and then we spent the first night at a friend of theirs' house in Colorado Springs as we were heading toward the Mesa Verde area. I'd never been to Colorado Springs, so it was really neat. And we only had the morning there, so we didn't get to see tons of stuff. But one thing that we wanted to see was Garden of the Gods, which is just a spectacular spot. If you've never been to Colorado Springs and you only have 3 hours, go to Garden of the Gods. It's just an absolutely wonderful place. It's very large. It's a huge place, 220 acres. And it's actually a city park, which is interesting. And it's these it's red sandstone, which is interesting. And I'm going to repeat this probably numerous times. This whole area, really almost anything west of the Mississippi and east of the Rocky Mountains, at one point was a huge inland sea. And, of course, all this is sedimentary rock. And we're going to see that again with Carlsbad and such. And obviously, in this case, there was a lot of iron content in whatever this sediment was. And you see this red rock all over the West. It's not just here in Colorado. And I know some of you have been up to Denver, Red Rocks and things like that. It's actually all over the place, wherever this particular layer is exposed. But here in Garden of the Gods, not only do you have this spectacular red rock, but because of the rising of the Rocky Mountains, however many million years ago that was, what used to be horizontal has now been pushed up and is now vertical. So what we're seeing is actually the lower level. If you walk around the other side, you're actually seeing newer rock on that side. It's all the same color and all that. So it's really intriguing how this has developed. And it's, again, the area is just enormous. I always get a kick out of this because we did not see a rattlesnake. We didn't hear a rattlesnake. So I always ask people, I said, are there really rattlesnakes here? And you get one of these kind of like, well, but on the other hand, nobody was off the trails either. I had that experience for the first time I was in Andersonville at the prison down there. And I wanted to go to one of the sites, and there was a big sign that said rattlesnakes. And so I asked one of the national park people, I said, are there really, I would say, I'd like to go over there. Are there really rattlesnakes there? He said, well, we saw one once, okay, but nobody goes there either. So I'm not sure if it's just crowd control or what. But I suppose it's possible. But again, nobody was off the trail, so it worked. Another, just a quick side story too. Another very clever. I was at a native site in Indiana. To try to keep people off of one of the native mounds, they had let poison ivy grow all over it. So there are all sorts of interesting ways to control crowds. But I thought this one was pretty clever. But we didn't see anything that even remotely looked like a rattlesnake. But it's just a spectacular, spectacular place. Wonderful trails going through there, driving trails. There are a variety of walking trails. This one is paved, as many of them are. You can get to most of the major features on paved trails, which is nice. But then there's some bridle trails, and there's some other trails too. Again, this is a very, very large park. And again, you can see it's just beautifully landscaped, and you have these kind of pillars all over the place that are that nice bright red color. This was actually proposed to be a national park in 1886 when the national park movement was fairly new. And for whatever reason, the federal government in 1886 said, nah, we're not interested. But people in Colorado Springs, which was a reasonably new area at that point we're even thinking about preservation, that somehow this is spectacular and we need to preserve this. But, of course, that takes money. So one of the city fathers got a hold of the man who owned the Burlington Railroad, showed him the site. It was up for sale, so he bought it. And then so it was privately owned, but never really. He turned it over to the city. And eventually his son, in 1909, actually deeded the entire thing to the city with the idea that it will be perpetually a city park. It will be open to the public, and it's just spectacular. So, and then they also left some money, which is nice too. So they were able to develop this park, and they had just gone through a major about 10 years ago. They opened a brand new visitor center museum, which is wonderful. They had redone all of these trails and so forth. It's really, really a spectacular place. This is, and I try to get people in here. You can see there's a person right here. So to give you an idea of how tall this is. This is called the Three Sisters. And again, once this was part of the sea floor and has been pushed up into this now vertical position, and then this is all wind erosion. You know, this is Colorado Springs. You don't see a lot of rain. There's snow and runoff, but you're not seeing a lot of rain here. So these features are basically from wind erosion. And so it's really a very different way to look at things. The seawater erosion gives you different patterns. But it's really spectacular, and they're just all over the place. And absolutely gorgeous. This is one of the recommended views. When you go, they actually hand you a card and says you should take a picture here. And this is one. There's even a sign there next to the rattlesnake sign. There's another one. Picture taken here. And this is what you see. And it is really, really spectacular. Again, 220-acre site. It's a big, big site. And just really, really nicely kept. Now, you also notice it's hazy in the background. Now, we in the East don't think twice about that because we have a lot of humidity here. So when you go to the mountains, you go down to the Smokies. They're not called the Smokies for nothing. It's cloudy, it's misty, even in the Adirondacks, things like that. Ordinarily, this would be quite clear. What you're actually seeing is smoke from the California wildfires, which were over 400 miles away. But there was so much, and you could actually smell it in the air, too. It smelled like charred wood most of the time we were there. So most of the pictures that you're going to see of anything distant are going to have that haze to them, but it's not humidity. It's actually smoke. But again, it gives you just an interesting idea of how this landscape is laid out, and just how absolutely gorgeous it really is. And no picture does these things justice. You know that. So it's but try. And this will give you an idea. That's actually Pikes Peak in the background. And again, that haze from the fires. Not all of the rock is that bright red color. There are some other colors in there too. There's actually some interesting blues mixed in as well. But it gives it a very, very striking appearance. And we were there in the morning, so this is morning sunlight. I can imagine in the long reddish rays of the evening, this would be just absolutely spectacular. But it'll give you an idea of the size of this, and Just wonderfully kept, really, really beautiful spot. And one of their features is balanced rock. Balanced rock is actually quite large. There are actually a lot of balanced rocks around in this area. You see them as you're driving around all over the place. And this one just so happens to be very large and in a park, so it's well photographed. But what you can see is happening, again, mostly wind erosion. This is harder sandstone than this particular layer here, which is pretty well gone from the bottom layers. But there's just enough of it there to keep this rock stable, at least for now. Sooner or later, it will not be balanced any longer. That may be next year, it might be 5,000 years. But it's interesting. But this one, again, look at the sculpting of this due to wind in this case, which is really interesting. And you can see in this case in the layering from the various episodes of oceanic activity that lay these sandstone layers down. So it's again, beautiful, beautiful place. Again, Pikes Peak in the background. This is all part of the Garden of the Gods. And again, that California wildfires giving us that real smoky look. It would have been nice to have clear look, but we didn't. You also notice there's no snow on Pikes Peak. The area is very dry. The West is having big problems. Remember last winter they were all excited because they finally had huge amounts of snow in some of the areas. It is not enough to make up for what's been missing for the last almost 20 years.
When were you there?
This was questions when we were there. We were there right after Labor Day. I usually travel the Wednesday after Labor Day and go through we were gone for 17 days on this trip. So this was actually the Wednesday after Labor Day. So everything you're seeing is in September. September's a great time to travel. All the kids are back at school, and you're out there with a lot of other retired people like you. so the pace is nice. It's really a good time to be out there. And yet the weather is usually pretty good in September. It does get, some of the nights get cold. I mean, we were out in desert environments. Days still get hot. Some of the hikes we wanted to take, especially when we got down toward Carlsbad area, some of the hikes we wanted to take, the Park Service said, no, you can't take them. This is already 105 degrees by 10 o'clock in the morning. And even though both of us are experienced hikers and we have all the right equipment and all that stuff, they're not coming out to get you. So they can't really stop you, but they really discouraged you from going. We're good rules guys. We obeyed the rules. Found other things to do, which there's no lack of out there. But this was just a great site. And again, if you happen to find yourself in Colorado Springs, please take the time and go to Garden of the Gods. It's just really wonderful. Now, that was not why we went. It just so happened to be a stop. We were on our way to Mesa Verde, which is about a 7.5-hour ride from Colorado Springs. And we generally are sort of unwritten rules. We won't drive more than about 4 hours. Why? What for? We're on vacation. We're enjoying ourselves. So we were going to a town called Montrose, which is in the middle of this really beautiful area of Colorado. And we had asked our host the night before and said, well, what would be the most scenic way to get there? And they kind of stared at us for a moment and said, well, pick one. So you can go through South Park and go through Telluride. It's just such an unbelievably gorgeous area. And so the drive itself to these places was really spectacular. This is what you're looking at. There are 26 peaks in Colorado that are over 14,000 feet, and so they call them the 14s. And they're fairly spread through the state. There are clusters of them, of course. But this is what you get, and this is what the landscape looks like in much of that southern part of the state when you're not right up in the mountains. And you notice that it may look green when you're at a distance. It will look very green. And it's a different green than our green. It doesn't look anything like the East. The East is very different. But as you get close, notice how much space there is between everything. And that all has to do with water. Water is everything. These plants will grow at a space. If they're too close, one of them's going to die. And so they will actually, by natural selection, they'll actually space themselves for the maximum water usage of that area. So you tend to see these rather long. Now, there's some green in here, too, small grasses. There's a lot of sage grass. and so forth. But it is a very, very different landscape. Very harsh in a lot of ways, but it's attractive in its own way as well. And here you can see there's some water down in this area. You do see some areas where there are dry beds, there are seasonal streams, there are occasional lakes, and of course there are reservoirs. The reservoirs were really, really low. Some of them were being drained for the winter. But some of them were just, so you can tell, and I'll show you a picture of one in a little while, that was just being drained. You can see where the grass has grown in. But just really spectacular landscape. And then every now and then you see just really cool stuff. You know, we came over this crest. I don't even know where this is. Okay, there was no town anywhere nearby. We just came over this crest, and first of all, you got this great scene here, and then there's a random hot air balloon floating around. And hot air ballooning is a really very popular thing out there because the weather is so good for it. It's dry. There's a light breeze. The mountains block the primary winds, so you tend not to get huge winds here. You get more gentle breezes, and of course you get the updrafts from the mountains, which is nice if you're ballooning. This is fairly early in the morning. This is maybe, I don't know, 10 o'clock maybe. And so we stopped and looked, and it was just kind of like, it was just such a neat scene. And the area itself, again, was just really spectacular. And here are more of the 14s in the background, just absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous land. And we weren't even to supposedly the scenic areas yet. As we were going, we climbed through an area called Monarch Pass, which is about 12,000 feet. So you're going up and up and up and up. And yes, you do notice if you get out of the car to do anything, you notice immediately that you're not here at 300 feet as we are. But everybody told us, there's bighorn sheep all over the place. These are the only ones we saw. And they happened to be standing on the side of the road looking at us, looking at them. So it was kind of fun. And you can see it's early in the season. This was September. So the spring rut, of course, was over. These are either young or they're just in the developmental stage of their horns. I don't know enough about bighorn sheep to be able to tell you these are female, male, whatever. But they were there very happily standing by the side of the road, posing for us, so we obliged and took a picture of them. And we saw signs of others in places. We saw tracks, and you'd see droppings and things like that. But we never actually got to see another one. So this was kind of fun to see. And this was around 10,000 feet or so that these critters were there. And this was what you get to see at Monarch Pass. This is the highest point I've ever been outside of an airplane. We were at 11,300 feet. And there's a ski resort right here. So there's about another 300 feet of mountain. We made it up about 100 feet and said, okay, that's enough. But it's really kind of a neat place. And of course, it's got a big souvenir stand and all that sort of stuff, which we avoided. But it was really kind of neat to be up this high. And you climbed it very quickly. And of course, you also dropped very quickly. But you only dropped to like 8,000 feet. So this whole area is around 7,000 to 8,000 feet by itself. And it does take some adjustment time. Your body will do all sorts of things. Drink a lot of water, but you don't pass a lot of water. And I asked actually a doctor that I know afterwards, okay, what was happening there? Because I don't mean to be gross or anything, but your urine gets very, very dark, which means you're passing a lot of blood cells out of your urine. And basically what he explained is your body from here has however many red cells it has. All of a sudden you get 11,000 feet and it's like, there's no air, there's no oxygen. So your body's trying to compensate for that. So you do have those reactions, and you do take a lot of water in, and so forth. It's really interesting. If you're aware of that, of course, you can stay healthy. But I did not get any altitude sickness or anything like that. But it was you noticed, and if you started doing anything, it very quickly, especially this high up, very quickly noticed that things were different. But when you crested out of Monarch Pass, you get a whole different landscape. Again, that's smoke from the fires in the background there. That's how intense that smoke was. But all of a sudden, you're in this high plains area, and again, just absolutely gorgeous. It was a little cloudy at this point too, so you don't get the brightness of the yellow grass. but it was just a spectacular spot. And so every time, you're kind of cresting, it's like, okay, what beautiful thing are we going to see next? And it's just a really, really exciting. And then eventually you come to the Arkansas River. Now, to me, the Arkansas River, I associate the Arkansas River with the Mississippi, and it is a Mississippi tributary. But and it just never occurred to me that it goes this far west. It actually starts in Colorado. And so as we came down into the Arkansas River Valley, you can see that it's divided here, too. The east half of the valley, quite green, a lot of farms and stuff here. The western part, however, because you've just got that slight rise, is much drier. So that was ranching over there. There were a lot of cattle ranches and all that. And just to, you see sort of the housing here. This is a community called Buena Vista. And Buena Vista has a role in my family's history. My great aunt, my great aunt and I were the only lefties in the family, so we always sat on the same side of the table. And she's also, I've told some of you the story before, when I was a new teacher in Rochester, she lived in Rochester. I was 22 and she was 92, and she let me share her house with her, and we got along great. We had a great time. But she was actually the first kindergarten teacher in this part of Colorado in 1903. And she lived in Buena Vista for 3 years. So it was important to kind of cruise through Buena Vista and see where my aunt had been. And I did send them their historical society. She had a lot of photographs that she had taken of she and some of her friends out here in the mountains and all that. So I sent them out there. And so it's kind of just a neat piece of personal history out there, but an interesting spot. And then eventually, as you travel south, you start hitting the mountains. This is more in the Telluride area, which is actually owned by the federal government. We associate it, of course, with great skiing, and there is great skiing out there, but all those ski resorts are actually leasing federal government land. And the story goes, as you read some of the historic, there are all these pull-offs where they have little historical plaques and, of course, nice views like this. And the federal government had been putting through roads and railroads. Originally, there was lumbering, mining, things like that in this area. And then the 20s and 30s came along, and of course, the Depression and crash. And it's like, okay, what are we going to do with this area? And somebody came up with they're looking around going, wow, this would be a great ski place. Maybe we can lease it to these ski resorts. And that's exactly what happened. So all of those nice ski areas that are out there are actually leasing federal land. And so it's a nice arrangement. They are keeping the land up, and the federal government still maintains its ownership and therefore control over what happens to the land. But it is just, again, spectacular. These are more of the 14s here. Just absolutely spectacular to see just a little bit of change starting with the colors at this point. They had a fairly warm summer. Not overly hot, but a little bit warmer summer. And they did have some nice moisture, apparently, this year. So the trees were not quite as far along as they might have been in other years. But it was it just kept getting better and better. It's just a beautiful area. And again, some more of the 14s. You can see a little bit of the permanent pack. Some of the permanent glaciation up in the mountains. But there was not very much of that. A couple of places where we stopped. This was not one of them, but a couple of them had pictures from like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And you can definitely see the glacial pack declining over those last 30 or 40 years. So that is a significant problem because this is an important water source for this area. And water is everything out there. It's just, whether you're talking about ancient people or modern people, water is just everything. But again, just an absolutely beautiful area. And everywhere you looked, it was nice. And this was just a drive, by the way. We were just driving for this part. We weren't even looking at anything particular. But then you come out of the mountains, and we hit this interesting reservoir. It was huge. The reservoir was probably 35 miles, 40 miles long. But this is what I was talking about, where you see the reservoirs are not doing what they're supposed to do because the water's not there. This greenery here indicates this should be underwater. And not only isn't it underwater, it hasn't been underwater in a long time. So you're getting vegetation growing there. So there's some serious water issues. And the companion problem with that is the population is actually growing in these areas. And so you have more people moving into these areas, stressing already a crisis in water. So that's ultimately what's going to stop development and growth in that southwest section of the country. They're literally going to run out of water, and you can see it here. But what I took this picture for wasn't for the water. It was this feature, which nobody could tell us what the name of it was. I'm sure it has one. But as you kind of rounded this corner, there this was. It was like, wow, that's really spectacular. It must have a name. And somebody said, yeah, probably. Okay. But this is actually the head of the Black Canyon, which actually ran right to the town of Montrose, which is sort of tucked into that southwest corner of Colorado. And but this was just a spectacular feature. Again, this was sedimentary rocks. This is not volcanic in this case, and you can see that this is all slump and talus slopes here. This is what used to be in all those crevices up there, and then this leads to this rather deep, narrow canyon, which is pretty spectacular in and of itself. And so it's again just a really interesting area. You could certainly spend a lot of time here as opposed to just drive through. But we were just driving through, so there we go. Next day, we made it into, we stayed at Montrose. There's an excellent brewery in Montrose called the Horsefly Brewery. It was right down the street from where we're staying. And it was funny. I must look older than I feel or something, because we stopped at this. We were at an older motel, and the clerk of the motel is probably 22 years old or so. And so we walked in and said, well, okay, where are there some good places to eat that aren't like McDonald's and all that? And he goes, well, so about 10 blocks down, there's this brewery, but I don't know if you guys want to walk that far. It's like... So we did. It was great. So if you're ever in Montrose, Colorado, go to the Horsefly Brewery. It was the food was excellent as well. It was a nice atmosphere, and sat outdoors. It was really kind of neat. But our goal was to get to Mesa Verde, which is, of course, one of the ancient native sites in the Southwest. And the first thing that I didn't realize is how huge Mesa Verde actually is. It is an enormous site. When you pull off, you go to Cortez, which is right near the Four Corners, and then driving out of Cortez, you turn into the national park. You climb. The visitor center is about a mile in. The campground is about 4 miles in from that. And then the sites themselves are either 20 or 40 miles further than that. And it's so you need these large blocks of time just to get where you're going. But in September, another reason to travel in September, there's almost no stress on the parks, which is really nice. This campsite here had probably 300 sites in it, and maybe 20 of them were taken. And almost none of them we were there for 3 nights. Nobody else was there for 3 nights. There were people coming and going. It was we were tenting. And I can't guarantee stuff about global warming, but I can tell you the Earth is getting harder every year. But it was a beautiful tent area. The campground was absolutely gorgeous. The facilities were excellent. And it was really quite nice. This is me. I journal when I'm on these trips so I can remember what we saw and all that. And just this is called Sunset Peak. Okay, for obvious reasons. And it was a really nice hike up there. Again, you're up 8,000 feet, so it was a bit of a strain, but it was nice. Okay, and but this is the park area, and what you're actually going to see are the cliff dwellings. But on the way, the land is just spectacular. This is again a huge area, and I actually had no idea. What you're seeing in the background, if you look very closely, and again, because this is the smoke from the fires. They call this back here Sleeping Ute Mountain. And with a little imagination, you see the guy's hair spread out here, his forehead, rather prominent nose, and a couple lips there. And so it does look, and of course the Ute Indians are the prevalent tribe in this particular area. But again, the landscaping is just fabulous. This is all part of Mesa Verde. All of this that you're seeing here to the left. But here in the valley area, Cortez would be just out of the picture a little bit to the right. That in the around 900 to 1200 AD, when this was at its peak, there are actually more people living in the valley then than there are now. They estimate as many as 20 to 30,000 people lived there in 1200. Today, there's only about 12,000. And the reason to live down there, of course, water. There are several small rivers and some seasonal streams that run through that area. So farming, particularly for corn farming and hunting and gathering, would have been good. Down there. So that was a fairly well-populated area. Mesa Verde itself is actually not a mesa. Mesas are flat. The word, of course, is table. This is actually technically what's called a cuesta. And cuestas are tilted. And Mesa Verde is tilted 7 degrees to the south. And that means that on the top, there are several advantages. The seasons are longer, so spring and fall. As spring starts earlier, fall lasts longer. So the growing season is about 3 to 4 weeks longer than it is down in the valley. Because of the prevailing southwest winds that bring dust and dirt, topsoil from other areas, it lands on top of the cuesta first before any of the residual gets into the valley. So the soil up there is being fairly constantly renewed. So if you had the nerve, really, or the gumption to go from the valley to climb up here about 1,200 feet or so and look at this fairly, what looks like from the valley, a very harsh environment, to get to the top, you actually might have had somewhat better living at the top. And they think at its peak, there may have been 6,000 to 7,000 people living in this very large area, not on top of each other by any means, and usually in villages of probably 40 to 50, but spread throughout. There are some 5,000 archaeological sites in the entire park. Of course, we concentrate on the cliff dwellings, but there are others as well. Just to give you an idea of how the Park Service has changed over the years, you can sort of see a line right about there. That was the original road built in the 1940s. And this is the west, where they don't believe in guardrails. The road was about 1.5 lanes wide. You could still, when we went over there to see, there's actually an observation point right about there. And you could look down and say, oh, my God, who would ever drive this road? Because if you were going one way and somebody was coming another, somebody had to back up until there was a station. So I would imagine there's some probably some interesting wheels and chassis and all that down in this area somewhere. And but it's really very, very striking, but very, very harsh land as well in this case. And again, give you a good idea of what the land looks like. Now, keep this in mind, because this has a huge impact on why people live in this area and what happens in the cliff dwellings. This is what people come to see. This is the area of the cliff dwellings. This is the this is Cliff Palace. This is the main, largest dwelling out there. And you can see, I'm sorry, this is not, I apologize. This is actually Spruce House, which is still, this is the third largest site. This site's actually in danger. You used to be able to go in here, and if you read any of the current literature, they'll talk to you that you can leave from the visitor center and go over to Spruce House. Not anymore, because this entire rock face is going to fall. Okay? There's a trail actually that you can take, and I'll show you some pictures of that in a little while. You can just kind of barely see where it's separating here. There's an enormous crack all across the top. And sooner or later, gravity is going to do what gravity does, and this whole front is going to come down. And of course, they don't want anybody in there when that happens. What's interesting, this is not a seismic area. So earthquakes and such like that are not a problem. No place on Earth is immune from them, but they're very, very rare here. So that's not a problem. This is just natural gravitational pull that's cracking this sedimentary rock here. But this site probably had 50 or 60 people living in it. It's fairly typical. It's well back from the edge. It's quite a climb to get up there. We're actually on the visitor center side here. You go down probably 150 to 200 feet into a valley below, and then you'd have to climb up. Now, the Park Service has very nicely made a trail for you. They did not have a trail. They didn't want anybody coming up. You don't do this to encourage visitors. Okay? So these sites are defensive sites. There's no question about that. They're not forts, okay, but they are built with defense in mind. And we'll look a little bit closer at some of the architecture and so forth. But this is fairly typical. There are 56 of these dwellings spread throughout the park, and they're interestingly spaced, both for the niches that they occupy, but also for distance one from another, because they're still competing for resources at this point. They moved down to about 1,000 years of occupation on the top. The mesas, and I'll show you some of those villages in a minute. They moved down here about 1200 AD, and that's the beginning of a massive drought period in Southwest history. There's about 60 years of drought, and they can tell that from the tree rings, dendrochronology. So at the beginning of that, people moved down into these sites. And think, whenever you see a site like this, think of the labor intensity to build that site. You're living on top of the mesa in villages where your ancestors have lived for 1,000 years. What compels you to move into a site like this? There is no access here. There is a small trail, and the accesses were blocked if they weren't natural, so that they would only one person at a time could get through them. And many of them had piles of stone next to them, which indicated that at night they actually brick them up so that unwanted guests wouldn't come in. For the most part, the people that lived here, men were about 5'6", women were about 5 foot to 5'2", much smaller than me. So through some of these sort of crevices, I had to kind of do this kind of stuff sideways to get through. But there's interesting, it's too far to see here, but in all of them, there are actually small niche holes that go up to the top. So apparently one way to get to the top, to where all your farming was, where most of the water was, where the animals were, is you crawled. You actually did the kind of the climb, or somebody did. I'm not going to do that, but somebody did, and probably lowered things by rope. Whether it was water or food, wood for your fires, things like that, into these sites. So you've got to think about why people would do this. What is it that would compel them? This is Cliff Palace, which is the largest. They think about 125 people lived here. And this is really in a fairly isolated spot. There are two major kind of branches of the mesa that are about a straight distance, probably about 4 miles apart, but car distance almost 20 miles. And so this is the major village on one of them. And you can see that they built towers. Some of these are 5 and 6 stories tall. There are kiva sites. That's what these circular sites are here. But there are also circular houses. Why? Who knows? When it's all right, everybody else is building a square house, I'm going to build a round one. We honestly don't know. But these small vents, these are not windows. The apartments have no windows in them whatsoever. They are smoke holes. They're vents. So the apartment here, you can see a door here, and there was at one time a roof of another house here. So whoever lived in this small apartment climbed up on somebody else's roof, went in, and then essentially had no light. Just this little smoke hole. Some of them, like back in here, there's actually an apartment in here as well. That has no smoke hole either. And they are small. A family of 4 would, even at their size, would have been very tight in these places. They would have been warm because this gets cold in the winter, and perhaps a little cooler in the summer. But you tended to live most of your life outside. And it's not have you noticed that right in the front here, that's about a 250-foot drop right there. So if you don't take pictures there going, wait, let me step back a little bit and get one more shot. No, you don't do that. So it's interesting. But again, notice it's under a huge overhang. And again, there's no access of any kind. The park has actually Park Service built an access here that did not exist in its time. And that was quite an architectural feat in and of itself. They're not forts. Again, they are not built like forts. At one time, the interpretation was that all the vent holes were actually for aeroports and things like that. And they were thinking in terms of Middle Ages European castles because that's what they were mindful of. They're not, but they're definitively defensive. They sit back so nobody can drop anything in on you. There is almost no way to come up you could, but you'd see them long before they got there. You just drop stuff down on them. And again, the side accesses are very carefully monitored. They are engineered to be narrow. If they weren't naturally narrow, they actually built structures to make them narrower. Some of them you actually had to crawl through them on your hands and knees. So only one person at a time is going to come through there. So you're really moving here because you're afraid of somebody. We don't know who. There's certainly signs of warfare and violence as resource competition becomes more and more prevalent as that drought goes on and on. There are some stories, not a lot of verification that perhaps even Aztec warriors were moving through. We do know that the ancestral Apache were moving into this area much more warlike than the ancestral Hopi and others who were living here. We loosely call these groups Anasazi. That's not a name you see a lot anymore. The Anasazi loosely means strangers, and there's some negative implications to that. So for about the last 15 or 20 years, the Park Service and archaeologists have sort of dropped that. And they now use the term ancestral pueblo. But that has problems also because the pueblo are a specific group of people. And these folks were probably ancestral to 7 or 8 different groups. The other problem is most of the literature still uses Anasazi, and especially anything over 20 years old. So there's kind of this jockeying about what to actually call these people. We have no idea what they call themselves. But they were here. But I want to start looking at the masonry. Masonry is spectacular. These people had incredible masonry skills and had been using masonry skills for at least 500 years before they came down into the cliffs. Most of these stones actually had been on top beforehand. They are repurposed, as we'd call it today. Why would you make these stones? These are not adobe, by the way. These are cut stone. Fortunately, fairly soft sandstones and limestones in the back.
What kind of tools?
Probably stone tools. But a harder stone tool will cut softer stone and help you shape it. Many of the stone parts of the tools survive. We don't know necessarily how they were hafted. And hammers are easy. Hammer, just take a big rock and you can do that and cut other rock with it. So it's a basic technology, but a very effective technology. And they did use mortar. That takes water. And there's not a lot of water, so the mortar would have been made probably seasonally. So we think construction was probably done seasonally as well. And then you'd stop when it dried up, and then perhaps in the late fall when you had early snows, late rains, you might do it again. But there's a lot of labor intensity in here. And remember, we've talked about this in other classes. Always be thoughtful of a process called calorie exchange. It takes about 2,000 calories for us to just do what we're doing every day. If you're actually working hard in an environment like this, probably takes more. How many calories does it take to build a village like this? And those calories are not replaceable. So if you're using them to build the village, you're not gathering food with those calories. You're not doing other things with those calories. So, and not that you're sitting there, we don't think they sat there and consciously counted calories, but they're very aware of if we're spending our labor here, it's not being spent here. And if you're going to do a massive building project like this, there's got to be a very compelling reason to do it, especially if you can be living on the top. And for some reason, we're not. And most of these smooth pathways were actually smooth at that time, too. They were generally pounded dust into stone like. Today, these are modern. This did not exist in the historic times. That's park stuff. But most of it is left as it is. Some has been reconstructed. Some has not. They've left a lot of it just as it is. So it's a very compelling site. Very, very elaborate architecture. Again, you see the curve. This was somebody's house. That's a door, the smoke hole. So that's a little apartment up there. And then you can see this is about 4 stories tall. So somebody had to crawl up on ladders or on other people's roofs to get into that site. And using the landscape as much as possible so you ease that issue of usage of calories and such. And you can see some very, very coarse work. Now, that's not somebody's house, as opposed to the houses where you have very, very fine masonry. They're very, very skilled as far as that goes. Our guide for this happened to be native himself. He was actually from the Sioux tribes up in South Dakota. Really interesting guy named Michael Night Eagle. But at the end of the tour, he makes these flutes. And so he said, I want to play a tune for you. So he played a couple of these. They were obviously native, probably chants at one time. But what was interesting is, as he was telling us afterwards, that when he plays these, there are 3 nearby cliff dwellings that are within about 1.5 miles or so. He can apparently be heard quite clearly in those. And across the valley, about 1 mile away, is what's called the Sun Temple, which was an incompleted structure, probably meant to be a worship site. And it's apparently very clearly heard in there. So whether this was intentional or not, there's an acoustic element to this as well. If you were in one of these other sites, or here in this site, you could hear what was going on in somebody else's village, which is kind of interesting, and may have been for good communication purposes, may have been because are they plotting against us? Who knows? But it's an interesting added element to that. They are all over the place. Of course, Cliff Palace is a big one. Longhouse is a big one. Most of them are not. If you look very closely, here's a cliff dwelling right in here. Maybe 20, maybe 30 people lived in there at most. And again, look at the access. How do you even get to that one? And yet, anywhere where there's a substantial niche, there's probably a dwelling. And this one had a couple extra interesting features. If you sort of go up here to 2 o'clock, there's a storage area. A bricked-in storage area. So they're actually storing grain and food. No way to store water. They're not storing water. So water was something you had to get every day. And these are all built. There's generally some sort of seepage in the back of these sites. They're not exactly caves. They really are niches. Some of them are rather deep. Some of them are 90, 100 feet deep. Some of them are only 20 or 30 feet deep. But at the back of most of them, there's at least seepage. Now, seepage is not going to keep you sustained. The average person needs at least 3 gallons of water a day. And if you even had 20 people living in here, that means you've got to have 60 gallons of water a day. That's one heck of a seep. And probably not so. You're still going up top to get water from the springs to the top. Water weighs 8 pounds per gallon. So that's a lot of carrying that has to be done every day. And so, think again of the lifestyle of the folks that are doing this. And why on earth would you do that when you could be living up here unless there's a compelling reason to be down there? And we don't know what that compelling reason was, but it's got to be big. We did take kind of a hike around. This is actually looking over the edge of one of those cliff dwellings. You see, you're not coming up there to visit. This one was about a 700-foot drop on top of that. And there are, one of the things, one of the people on our tour asked, well, what'd you do about kids? Well, you watched them really closely. My thought is they probably had ropes around them. I don't know. That's what I would have in mind. But probably people fell. There's no question about it. But again, the harshness of the land underneath gives us, again, an idea of why on earth would you do this? Why would you move to these sites? This is on top of the mesa. Again, the top of the mesa is occupied for somewhere around 1,000 years prior to the cliff dwelling phase. And there are actually 5,000 archaeological sites here. Most of them are on top of the mesa, and there are literally scores and perhaps hundreds of small village sites that were on top. This is actually one of the oldest, and this is the sacred site. This is the kiva for this particular group. And this is one of the oldest in the site. And it has a lot of interesting features. There is an entrance. At one time, there would have been a roof. You can see there are actually 4. You can see 3 of the 4 post holes here. They would have been supporting some sort of roof structure, probably dome-shaped, because that's still how it's done. To indicate perhaps there are all sorts of thoughts about what that indicates, the curvature of the earth, pregnancy, whatever. And architecturally, domes were actually not as hard to build as some other structures out of mud and the daub and wattle. They all have a fire pit, almost dead center. Many of them also have a hole called the sepupu, which is tied to the creation story, that the first people came through a small hole in the earth. And almost all of these kivas have one somewhere. Later on, they're pretty uniform. They're going to be found basically down in this area. You have the entrance, the fire pit, and then a very small, sometimes really tiny, only about 4 or 5 inches. Okay, but it's always there. There was, even in this one, there was places to sit. And now this was quite low. It's only about 2 feet deep. And that's a substantial difference between this one and later ones. The later ones can be 20 and 25 feet deep. This one was not. It did have also a side, whether that was for storage, no idea. But it did have a side chamber as well. So this is one of the most ancient ones. This one was somewhere around, they think, 1,000 years before some of the later ones. This is what a later one looks like. It's almost identical. Except this one has very fine brickwork around it. It's much deeper, but it has the same entranceway here. The sepupu is here. The fire pit is here, interestingly enough. These large blocks here were probably originally here because air would have come through the entranceway and blown out your fire. So almost all of them have a baffle built in front of the entranceway to block the wind. Please, Elsa.
What material for the posts?
The question is what material for the post would have been wood. Okay, from the top, but there's not a lot of wood up there, and there are no really big trees. Junipers will grow to about 20 feet, but they don't have particularly straight trunks, so you would have had to really search for them. And the types of pines, not there. There's some thought that they may have gone elsewhere to get those trees. Not a lot of evidence for that in this site. There are in some others. So probably a low dome roof of some sort that could have been made with low posts and then weaving the branches together and then covering them with mud. Okay, that's the most likely scenario for these. And this one would have been covered the same way. There were no stone coverages too heavy. It would have fallen in. But again, you can see all the same things are here. Now, what these niches are here, there's some thought that there might have been slits in the roof to allow the sun in at certain times of the year that might have lit up an icon of some sort, maybe an offering of some sort. And later on, this gets very elaborate in some of the large caves that you see, like in Chaco Canyon. Some of them have 26, 30 niches in them. So they're definitively ritual sites. And so it's interesting. This is called Tower House for obvious reasons. This is 6 stories tall. They think about 50 people lived here, and this is one of the problems. You see there's a lot of structure here. This is actually not their structure. A lot of this is the park trying to keep this from collapsing. The walls are not necessarily engineered where the bottom walls are thicker and the top walls thin out. These were built relatively quickly, so that was not part of the architecture. So they are subject to shifting and, of course, to the forces of gravity. But the feature here, the land, the top of the mesa is about 100 feet above this. And again, there's probably a 300 or 400 foot drop right off it. And we could not see. We're on a promontory observation post out here. I could not see any entrance to this one anywhere. It obviously had to be there. And you could, above it, see, again, those little finger and toe holes. But I don't know how many people are going to go up and down that in any given day. And they're certainly not going to carry a lot of stuff coming back down. So this is, but it's interesting because, again, these are all doors, keep in mind. Okay, they're not windows. You notice no windows in this side at all. Okay, not even vent holes. And so this is, it's an interesting site. Okay, so all the collection and stuff of food is going up on top of the mesa. There are a lot of resources up there. There's water up there, not huge amounts, but there is water up there. Most of it from snow melt, seasonal melt. But I've heard many times from archaeologists, anthropologists, and all that, people ask, all right, how did they build Stonehenge? How did they build Machu Picchu? How did they build the cliff dwellings? And the answer generally is the same. If you have enough people and rope, you can build anything. So the key is to find out what you make the rope out of. Well, here it's made out of yucca. And yucca grows everywhere. You might have yucca in your house. My mother had a yucca plant for years. And we used to pick these fibers off because they were annoying. Well, if you pick these fibers off and they spring out twice a year, and again, yucca is everywhere. And one of the guides actually did this for us. He just pulled out about 5 or 6 strands and just, wound them together. Had a nice little piece of rope. And so rope was there. And there actually are remains. This is a very dry environment. So archaeological features, even like rope, which don't last long ordinarily, actually last here. So they actually do have a stretch of rope that's over 100 feet long, okay, in one of the museums, which is really neat. So the resources to do that were there. And the nice thing about yucca is you can eat the fruit as well. Apparently, according to the guides, it tastes terrible, but you can eat it. Okay? So taste was probably not a big concern. We did one of the nice hikes called Petroglyph Trail. It was about 3 miles long. And many of you know me. I'm not an edge person. Okay, that's like Carl on the other hand is, hey, Tom, look at this. No, that's not me. It's like, I'm okay. I'll take it right here. You have the camera. You take the picture down there. But there was not a lot of choice on this trail. So we were pretty close to the edge here. But it was a neat trail. Started there at Spruce House. Went out to this point called Petroglyph Point. There were not a lot of petroglyphs around here. They're there. One of the oldest, there's a house they actually call Kokopelli House. And you might know the little Kokopelli, the hunchback flute player. There's a thought, and Miss Night Eagle was telling us a story there. There's a thought that might be a representation of a real person. He might have been a traveler of some sort. And of course, having a deformity like that was considered very spiritually special among a lot of Southwest Native groups here in the East too. And so this might have been an actual person who then becomes mythological. But there actually is an etching of Kokopelli in the back of one of the houses. But this is an interesting site because, again, there were not a lot of petroglyphs around, except in this one site. If you step too far to the right, it was a long step down. But it's stunning land. Okay, it's stunning land. Of course, again, people largely living on top. If you look close, these are actually modern-day water towers back here. But it's really striking. And you can see that, again, you had to kind of work your way through. Carl's about maybe a size smaller than me. He's probably about 5'9", maybe, weighs about roughly 165 pounds or so. So he's not as large as I am. So you imagine if he had to turn to get through that, I had to turn even more. and there were places that he went through that's like, I'll take the stairs, thanks. And so it's interesting. But this is what we were looking at. And it's all the way out on a promontory by itself, and it's the only collection of petroglyphs in this entire park. So there is obviously some significance to this site. Now, you could also be a wag and say, well, you know what happened? The first guy got out there and said, wow, that was a long walk, so I'm going to leave my mark. And then because one person leaves their mark, everybody else has to too. That's distinctly possible, but unlikely. There are some signs in here that show up in what are definitively known as sacred sites. Like these, this group here, generally indicating mountains of some sort. Some of the existing tribal legends and so forth, mountains are very important. We, again, don't know specifically for the people that lived here, but stories get passed. Okay, so there's presumption that some of those stories at least have their elements this far back. Lots of handprints, of course, not a big surprise. Lots of snake symbolism, which is also lightning symbolism, which is interesting how those are joined. Lots of dogs or sheep or something. It wouldn't be sheep yet because they weren't there. Mountain goats, perhaps. Okay, and then this figure is very common all throughout the Southwest. It's sort of like a splayed person, oftentimes very distinctly male. And this one probably was at one time too. But absolutely no idea what the significance of that figure is. And then oftentimes very long-tailed lizards. Okay, and then lots of spirals. You don't see a lot of spirals and circles on this one. You see a few, okay, but oftentimes lots of spirals. Nobody really knows what the symbols mean. And there were probably symbols down here as well. This is an unusual petroglyph site in that it's really not protected. There's no ranger standing out there. You do have to sign to go out there, more because they want to make sure that you don't get lost or step off one of those cliff edges. And you have to sign in when you get back. But these types of things are heavily looted in the Southwest. There is a huge problem because of the vastness of some of these sites. Looting of particularly Native American art is a huge, huge problem in the national park system. There just aren't enough rangers, and there just aren't to patrol it all. And again, some of these sites, some of our national forests, our national preserves are hundreds of square miles. And it's just impossible. So this is a sort of on your honor site. Take all the pictures you want, go ahead, but please don't touch. And you can see again, there's been natural damage to this one as well. But it was really pretty neat, and it was a great hike. On the way to Witherall Mesa, which is the further one out, I was very surprised to see horses. And they were definitely feral horses. There's no question about that. And so I asked. And it turns out that they are strays from the Ute Reservation, which is across the valley from this site. And for many, many years, the National Park Service and the Ute Indians would gather up in the fall, and they'd have a horse roundup and return them all to the Ute Nation. About 15 years ago, the Utes decided that they no longer really needed these horses, so they stopped that process. And that, in turn, created a problem for the National Park Service. They didn't have the resources to gather up these horses, and once they gather them up, what do you do with them? So they started out with just 10. About 15 years ago, there are now 40. And they are having a significant impact on the elk and deer population because they compete for the same food resources. And they're much more aggressive than either elk or deer. So they were interesting. And there are big signs everywhere, don't approach, and all that. And we didn't, but they were interesting. And you can see there are signs all over in this particular place.
This was actually across the valley. This is a watchtower. And in almost any area where there are cliff dwellings, if you go out the valley far enough, you'll find a watchtower. And again, this gives us the idea that there's a defensive reason for doing this. Okay, you're not living there because it's desirable living space. You're living there because you're afraid of somebody. You're protecting yourself from someone. This happens to be on the Ute Reservation across the way. But there are a whole series of these towers. You can see there's no windows, doors, or anything. There's actually a door on the far side. But this is a strictly defensive structure. Sometimes they're actually associated with a kiva. This one isn't. But some of them actually were. People lived on the top for years and years. The older a place is, the larger the stones are. As people get better at stone masonry, the stone masonry work gets much more fine. The stones tend to get smaller. So this is one of the actual oldest villages there. And villages were built on top of villages on top of villages. They would be abandoned for a period, sometimes 100 or 200 years, sometimes maybe a generation or two. The next group would come and build right over it, generally because there's water nearby. And again, water is everything in this area. So this one was actually built over 2 other villages, but was still quite ancient. Many of the stones are missing because, again, when people move down to the cliff dwellings, why would you make new stones? Just go up to the old, decaying villages, grab the stones from there and move them down. So a lot of them were repurposed. This stuff drives me nuts. And again, those of you that take my classes know that. One of the sites had definitive signs that a stockade had been built around the site. There are at least 45 post holes, and as we said earlier, wood was not common. So this was a major endeavor to build a stockade around this village. There's a push, sort of the myth of the peaceful Indian sort of thing. The Park Service doesn't want to offend anybody, so they make almost no mention of the fact that there actually is a lot of evidence of warfare out there. About 1 out of every 4 skeletons found shows signs of violence. Something was going on. You don't build a structure like that. The official interpretation, it was built to keep in turkeys. Okay, I can tell you don't need a fence to keep turkeys. I have about 30 that come to my backyard every day, and all I got to do is put out a little food, and they're there. And when you don't put it out, they let you know. And of course, these people weren't stupid. You clip their wings. So that's the dumbest explanation I've ever heard. The only person of all the interpreters that we talked to, because I would ask, and you kind of get the shuffling feet. Mr. Night Eagle had no problem saying, "Oh no, there was warfare all over the place." So at least the native interpreter himself had that idea. But this kind of stuff, you're giving faking history doesn't help anybody. There's nothing. People have, unfortunately, a violent history no matter where they are, and to pretend that they didn't just defies logic in a site like this. This, again, is a kiva from a little bit later site. You see this one much more developed. Here's the baffle, still the entrance. This one has the benches in it. And interestingly enough, many of the benches are tall enough, so you would have had to push yourself up to get on them. Your feet would not have been on the floor. And I don't know if there's some significance to that. It would seem to me so, because you could certainly build them lower. Okay, so there must have been some significance. They're not all like that, but there are a significant number that are. Okay, and again, you see the secondary hole. Again, what happened in there, we don't know. There is some charring in some of them, so fire of some sort, maybe a ritual fire. This one does not have the wall niches in it. So it doesn't have that. But again, you can see that sacred space maintained itself for a period of 1,000 years. And that's not unusual. If you look at the way churches developed, go back to a church from 500 and look at one being built today, they're still basically the same, because the same rituals take place in them. Okay, so that's not necessarily unusual. If you go to the site, I strongly recommend get on the first tour of the day. They're usually about 9 o'clock or 9:30. You may have to drive an hour and a half to get there, but it's worth it, because when you arrive at the site, there are no people there. You go an hour later, and there are going to be 200 people wandering around the site. But by arriving first thing in the morning, this is what you see. And this is Longhouse. This is the second largest dwelling. It's about, again, 4 miles as the crow flies, about 20 miles across the top of the mesas. So these people were not in direct competition with the people from the cliff dwelling which is the other very large site. This one is one room smaller than that one. So this is number 2, but trying harder. But again, you see the same sort of architecture here. Same thing. These are doors, not windows. A repurposed stone all over the place in this one. But again, the defensive structure. Now, I know this is hard to see because it's hard to see in real life. This is a handprint. Okay, but it's got a very interesting feature. There are 6 fingers on this one instead of just 5. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fingers and then the thumb, which is really interesting. It's the only one like that. Please.
Do they think that the move from the top of the place into the cave happened the same in all the developments in the area? Or?
Yes, the question is, did the movement from the top of the mesa down into these cliff dwellings, did it all happen about the same time? Yes. Around 1200, which is sort of the beginning of that long drought period. They're also all abandoned by 1275. They're only lived in for about 2 generations, and many of them are abandoned quite quickly, and you can tell by what was left behind. And think of your own house. If you were told you had 3 days to get out of your house, what would your house look like when you left it? And that's what some of these houses look like. Some of these people left very quickly. Others, people left a little bit more over time because there's less stuff. Large stuff is always left behind. So large pots, things like that are left behind. But it was abandoned quite quickly. And again, nobody knows. That's one of the mystery of the Anasazi. Where do they all go? We have a pretty good idea where they went now. They went down toward the Rio Grande, and where there was more resources, particularly more water. And there's strong evidence, pottery evidence, that shows that some of these groups went to river valleys further south. But they do disappear very quickly, and they move very quickly. These are only occupied for about 75 years, not long. Good question. But this is what you're looking at again. From the top, you're well back, so you're in the shade, not necessarily out of the wind, and not even necessarily out of the snow, but generally, and there's no issue there. They don't all face one direction or anything like that. It's wherever the landscape allowed. So some had afternoon sun, some have morning sun. It was not happy living. Just put it that way. But for us, it's spectacular. This is an attempt to store water. This is you can see the channels here. There are about 8 of these. But this is only holding about maybe 1.5 quarts of water. And this is a seat, very typical. You can see there's water there because there's greenery. But this is nowhere near enough to sustain a village, in this case, of probably 100 people. They need a lot of water every day. But this would be for a quick drink or something that you needed. The sacred sites here, you can see there are lots of them. But in a site like this, they're going to be multi-purpose. You're not going to make that site and just leave it for ritual. You're going to live down there when necessary. There's evidence of weaving that had taken place down there, sorts of things like that. You didn't have the room to not. But again, take a look at that first step off the edge. It's pretty significant. And again, how would you get to this? There's now a path that the park system has built. And you can see some of them are tucked right up in the top, too. Those are other apartments. So it's really spectacular. It's really spectacular, very clever. But, why would you do that?
Do they estimate how long it would have taken them to build those?
They were probably built over time. It appears that they were pretty consistently being built during that 75-year period. The technology to build was already there. They didn't have to invent that because they've been building on top for years. But they think that probably the first groups to go down there would have built the primary structures. Probably in a year or two, you would have been able to certainly live there, and then you would have built according to your needs. But they're being constantly built and repaired. That's a good question. This little guy, there are lizards all over the place, so there are bugs and all sorts of other things. However, they rarely pose for you. So I made a promise to this guy. This is a collared lizard that if he'd stand still for just about 10 seconds, I'd make him look like an alligator when I made this presentation. So there he is in all his glory. And they're everywhere, which again gives you an idea that there are insects around. And if there are insects, there's stuff that insects eat as well. So there is resource around. Please.
In the previous film, there's a ladder there.
Yes.
Were they aware of ladders at the time?
Their ladders didn't look like this, but yes, there was no way to get up to some of the places. They probably had a pole ladder, which would have been a single trunk of a tree of some sort, probably 6 or 8 inches with niches carved in the side.
You do actually have to climb up these ladders to get to the sites, but these are modern ladders because there are liability issues. They don't want you climbing up a pole ladder and such. Let's take a quick break, and when we get back, we'll move on to Chaco Canyon, a few other places, maybe 5 minutes.